Now, this idea of rising and falling, at least as it relates to cities, countries, and great powers in the past, is really something that's regularly discussed, I would say, in Singapore, particularly among the political and the intellectual elite. For example, PAP politicians like George Yeo and Alvin Tan many, many years ago urged us to learn lessons from Renaissance Venice. And Venice, as you know, was a geographically small, but disproportionately wealthy and powerful city-state that was, however, rather short-lived in the grand sweep of history. Chan Chun Sing, in his famous Kichu speech at the start of his political career, he asked his audience to consider the factors that led to the decline of two other small states, the Lanfang Republic in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the Sultanate of Demak in the 15th and 16th centuries. From these musings, we generally learn that small states like these ones, they start to decline when bad choices are made as the geopolitical context shifts. They decline when they have not invested enough in their defense capabilities. They decline when there is division and disunity in society. And I guess above all, they decline when the quality of leadership declines. So Singapore has the benefit of hindsight, and with an open and curious mind, can learn from the mistakes of the past. But Singapore has also invested in its capabilities for anticipating the future. We have, at the highest levels, developed and used tools and techniques for imagining plausible futures. We do this to help inform the kind of decision-making that we do in the present. In fact, our speeches very often have a future orientation. This one that you see on the screen in front of you is by the deep thinking head of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, who gave the speech in 2015 from an imaginary vantage point of 2065. Now that's extraordinary, right? And we also have had national level public engagement exercises, or perhaps I should call them public envisioning exercises, to promote the collective imagination and the shared narration of our future. So all of this, I think, points to a very significant capacity to do what my former colleague, Nyo Kun Seong, many years ago would have described as thinking again, thinking across, and thinking ahead. But as with many things, political interests come to confound them. For instance, when we start to misuse the past and the future in ways that explain, affirm, and justify how well we are doing in the present, Ownself, praise Ownself. We might say, if only Lanfang or Demak or Venice were able to do what Singapore is doing today, they would have survived and prospered for longer. And we might even say, if we in Singapore want to survive and prosper for longer, then we had better ensure we have the right leaders. And at this point, we know, of course, what right leaders is code for, right? It means vote for the People's Action Party and not for opposition politicians. So it kind of gets into this sort of mess at some point. Let's put that aside for a minute. And let me say something about research. Now, most academics, I think, shy away from talking about the future. And for good reasons, I think. However, when looking back on some of my own publications, I find that I have often gotten away with writing about how things might evolve into the foreseeable future. And I want to highlight 3 of these publications for you. Donald has already mentioned 2 of them. Now, the first one is this article in 2008, in which I described how meritocracy, a key factor in Singapore's success story, had been shifting over the decades in the direction of a crude form of elitism. The focus on meritocracy had shifted from opportunity to allocation to competition and to reward. And I argued that the systemic transformations from survivalism to developmentalism and to neoliberal globalization, which is the current stage that global city Singapore is in, would cause the further weakening of Singapore's meritocracy as a glue that holds society together. Today, 15 years later, I can safely say that I think I was mostly right about this. Now, here's a second article, also referred to by Donald, published in 2012, and in which I discussed how Singapore's thoughtful, courageous, and more dynamic practice of pragmatism, another key factor in the Singapore success story, had degraded over time into a rigid ideology. In fact, into what I now recognize as a dogmatic adherence to the overriding value of economic growth and the pervasive logic of the market that governs and thereby constrains, in sometimes very, very crude ways, nearly every sphere of our lives. Now, let me bring to your attention a third article, which Donald didn't refer to. And this is a 2011 chapter, a simple chapter, in which I wrote about the Greek myth of Narcissus and Echo, and what this myth can tell us about Singapore. So here's the story. A very handsome Narcissus was so in love with his own image, reflected in the river, that he ended up drowning in it. So I asked the question, would the PAP government also drown in its own self-absorption? Now, in the story also is the nymph Echo, a water spirit, who sought the romantic attention of Narcissus, but she was cursed never to be listened to. And I asked, maybe a little playfully, would the people of Singapore, including its loving critics, be detached from a self-regarding and quite possibly narcissistic political elite, and in that way be reduced to a mere echo? Now, since the time I wrote these and other pieces like them, the situation, I think it's fair to say, seems to have worsened. By 2019, I was giving lectures with titles like Singapore's Finest Years Coming to an End. I was starting to think specifically about decay and whether it was fair or even useful to think of Singapore as a decadent technocracy. This was, to be sure, a painful exercise. As Singapore is my country, and I have often spoken very proudly of its achievements, its considerable achievements, and of what others may choose to learn from them. But I also believed that if, as a scholar, you cared enough about your country, you would have to speak up. Now, this year, what were described as political scandals in Singapore made the headlines around the world, prompting many observers to ask and maybe attempt to address the question of whether something was going very badly wrong in Singapore. Among these questions was whether this principle of own self, check own self, was beginning to show its practical limitations. Or should we believe that it was clearly working well by virtue of the fact that these cases had, after all, been surfaced and then dealt with openly and decisively? Did people have reason to expect even worse scandals to come? And if so, was there a need for better checks and balances? I mean, these are clearly not easy questions to answer. And we can no longer, it would seem, rely on past examples alone to convince ourselves that Ownself can indeed check Ownself today, as PAP politicians keep insisting. But what has changed in post-LKY Singapore, post-Lee Kuan Yew Singapore? Some people think that after rising to some level of greatness, Singapore is now starting to decline. And this is because of the quality of leadership and a system that is kind of fraying and starting to break down. Others think that Singapore hasn't really changed enough, but needs to, so that it can cope with and benefit from the changing circumstances. Yet others believe that Singapore's rise to some level of greatness always contained the seeds of its own decline. There are those who don't think the past was all that great in the first place, and that success was just an illusion, a product of nostalgia and selective history. And there are those who say it is simply meaningless to compare past and present. Now, depending on where you look and where you're standing, they are all in some way or other correct. All these positions are correct.